All right, good morning everyone. Happy to be here for lecture 13 on this wonderful Thursday. So today I think we'll talk a little bit more about competition and monopoly, and maybe talk a little bit about the policy aspects of monopoly. So I have been putting together 12 and 13, maybe it should be 11, I think 11 and 12. I have been putting together and getting up your readings on the subject. I was hoping to kind of show you on Top Hat, but you may have guessed once again it's not working on the classroom computer for whatever reason. We forge onwards with the tools we have, so if you have any questions about that, please let me know. And also another homework will be coming soon here. So pursuant to the classwork that we'll be doing here, it looks like we have class, today's the 26th of March, right? And then if I've added 5 to that successfully, we have class on the 31st of March. And then we miss a week and a half of class because of break, right? I think that's what it is. So it works out to be not only the Thursday, the 2nd, but we also miss the 7th and the 9th. And then I think what will happen is when we get back, we'll sort of start up an exam cycle. I'm kind of thinking right now, well, I'm not, this is the first time I've thought about it, that it might be better to have the exam on the Thursday, just because then you sort of have the review a day and then the exam. So I'll think about that, but just so it's on your radar screen. It's still, a month away basically, but we have to have our next exam, and of course we all know how the whole process works. So hopefully it'll go just as smoothly as it did before. Yes. No, it'll just be the stuff since the last. Yeah, we don't no inclusive, all-inclusive exams here. Just whatever it'll usually be about 8 lectures of stuff, and then we'll talk. Of course, I could do the usual Weasley professor thing and say, well, you do have to know the foundations that we learned. But no, just since the last exam is the new material. Okay, so what we did last time was we thought a little bit about market power, how it works in general, right? What really the big deal is with market power. And really all it amounts to is that anybody, right, be it an independent seller of coffee or Microsoft or an automobile manufacturer, anybody who has some market power, right, perceives that they face a downward sloping demand curve, right? Unlike in competition where firms take the price of the product as given, right, determined in the market, when there's market power, the demand curve slopes downward. Okay, well that's great. Why does that matter? Well, now the firm sort of thinks about itself as choosing a quantity and a price. And what that really means is that if I want to sell more of a product, I need a lower price. If I want a higher price, I need to sell less of the product, right? So now you have this menu of choice of prices and quantities, right? Of course, you're still constrained by the market. You can't say, well, I'd like to sell a lot of the product at a high price. That's just, no one will buy it, right? So you still have to get people to buy your product. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So we did see that operationally what this amounts to is, well, deriving this new entity, marginal revenue, which falls faster than price, right? That is to say, it lies below demand, right? And we saw that firms want to price or choose the quantity and price combination where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, right? Okay, so that was kind of if you want to think about it this way, that was the positive or predictive content of our model, right? Describing how people operate. And then we thought about why do we care about this? Well, we saw that we could use our welfare analysis tools, consumer and producer surplus, right? And we could determine that, well, yes, the price is too high and the quantity is too low, but what it also amounts to is a deadweight loss due to this market power, right? What I thought I would do is, now that we have this fundamental observation in our minds, right, how this all works operationally, we can think a little bit about the real world aspects of it, right? What is it that gives firms market power? in various settings that is different from the competitive model, right? And then, of course, there's this policy question: what is it? What should we do about it? So, the market power. We saw that when we constructed our competitive model, we did so in such a way so that every firm really had no control over the price, and this amounted to assuming that everybody produced the same exact thing, like wheat or oil or something. That we had this huge amount of sellers. Right? So every, say, individual maple syrup producer was really small relative to the market, and that people could come and go freely into this industry, right? Maybe it took a little time, but you could enter or exit, right? So put another way, there were no barriers to jumping into this industry. So really what we've done also in putting together this competitive model is now we also have a way of saying, well, what happens when we move away from these things, right? And really just moving away from any one of these things, some of them are intertwined, results in some degree of market power. So we'll get into that as the lecture goes on. But let me just remind you what the graphics look like here when we, just the generic graphics. So up top, this is kind of how we did our comparison of the two. We see we have a demand and a marginal cost curve. What I really should have done is added marginal cost equals supply. And you can see what happens. Where demand and marginal cost equals supply cross, well, that gives that point that's marked PC on the diagram, right? And it gives a price and a quantity that go along with the competitive outcome, right? Where M, C, and D cross. So that's what a competitive market would do. QM, PM, where the point M is marked, well, that's what a monopolist winds up doing. That is what happens, that's where marginal revenue, see the green line up there, and marginal cost cross, yes? We take that's the quantity the monopolist produces, and we go up to M, and then we go across, and that gives us a price and a quantity. So you can see from the top diagram, price higher, quantity lower in a monopoly, right? Relative to competition, and I know I keep saying it over and over again, but you can say things like, well, prices are too high or quantities are too low or whatever, but it really doesn't mean anything unless you have a benchmark. Our benchmark is that competitive outcome. Well, down here, we have what we really care about, or what we care about perhaps even more than just saying prices are low, prices are high and quantities are low. We have the full-blown welfare analysis. If we take the PC dot and do the welfare discussion, we see that C and B is producer surplus, right, below price, above the supply line or marginal cost line. And consumer surplus is everything below demand yet above price, that's D, C prime, and A, right, green shade on the diagram. And we add that together, we get total societal welfare, right, total gains from exchange in the market. We can do the exact same thing for the monopoly over here, right? In the monopoly, right, we see the price is high, the quantity is lower. C plus C prime now is what the monopolist gets in producer surplus. And D is consumer surplus. So you can see that monopolies wind up with more producer surplus than a similar competitive industry. Yes? Say that again?
Why isn't point M at the intersection?
Point M at the intersection here? Point M derives from the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost, right? And so marginal revenue is kind of it's not really an observable, right? We have to sort of compute it from thinking about how things change, right? More output. And I'll get into this as we move along. So we have to go up to the demand curve to figure out what the price corresponding to that marginal revenue is. So that's kind of how it works. And I'll have an example where I show you, I'm going to calculate it out and all that in a second. Anyways, the great thing about this, to uncomfortably segue away from the question, is, well, you can see here what the monopolist is doing. It's kind of pulling quantity back and raising price a little bit to capture some of the consumer surplus, right? Because C prime has shifted from consumers to producers. And in the process of doing this, some of the some of the surplus is destroyed, right? That is to say there's deadweight loss, right? Put another way, the monopolist pulls back its quantity a little bit and says, okay, I want to do this to keep my price high. It's too bad, however, that I know I could produce product and I know people would buy it at more than it costs to produce, but I'm going to dig into my profits too much if I produce and sell these units. Those are all the A and B units there, and that's what we call the deadweight loss to monopoly. You might even say the deadweight loss to market power, right? And that's kind of how it all works. So the archetype, right, of the monopolist is, it's interesting. Most of this economics was developed in the, I guess you could say, late 1800s, early 1900s. And if you think about the history of the period, that's still kind of what theory leans on for the archetypal monopolist, right? It's Steele or J.P. Morgan or Rockefeller or Carnegie, right? People like this, the monopolist with the enormous, railroad company or steel company or oil company or whatever. And that's kind of what this theory is looking like, right? These folks restricting the amount of steel out there to raise the price, and that was the big concern at the time. So that's kind of what we have in mind when you think about this, and that's kind of what you can think about, how you can think about our comparison as functioning here, right? Is we sort of say, well, what would happen if we took this industry, this oil industry, and instead of being competitive, it was run by one person, right? It's kind of how we're thinking about it. So there's really no distinction between the firm and industry in this graph. So some of the other math here, I don't know if it's math, but we can see that in monopoly, the price winds up being greater than the marginal cost of production. That's kind of my first bullet point here. Whereas in a competitive market, the price winds up being equal to the marginal cost. And also we had this other result that firms were forced to produce at the minimum of average cost, right? And so, we had this picture in competition where really what I argued was that in the end, this industry would settle at this point Q2, right, with price P3. It's kind of a poorly labeled diagram. The price ultimately would be P3 here, and firms would be producing Q3, and that's right where marginal cost and average cost are equal. Right? I guess I can't. Let me see if I can. Yeah, my average cost drifted off the side there. So that was an interesting aspect of efficiency that came from, you'll remember, entry and exit. Right? Firms were forced to minimum average cost. Now, a monopolist is a little bit different, and this is a version of the picture. This is my, if I'm the local barber, I'm the only person cutting hair in a town. This is a description of how my problem might turn out. So I have my marginal costs of doing haircuts, right? That's kind of like my supply. My marginal revenue, right? You'll remember in this example we had a pretty well-defined description as to how that worked. I produce 3 haircuts per hour at marginal revenue and marginal cost equal. It turns out this corresponds with the price of 14, right? So I would charge $14 and sell 3 haircuts per hour. And in so doing, I would make a profit, right? So you can see here my costs per haircut are $10. My price is $14. So I'm making 4 times 3. That blue rectangle has an area of 12. I'm making $12 an hour of profits. Now, in a monopoly, right, I'm the only firm in the industry, so almost by definition, no one can come in or out of my industry. So I just keep making these profits, right? Every hour, on the hour, for as long as I live, right? And once again, there's no distinction between the short run and the long run here, so I just keep kind of accumulating these profits by assumption. So you might be saying, well, that's unsatisfying, Baker. Why is there no entry into this hair? I could start up a barber and charge $12. What here rules that out? And therein, right, lies the idea that what we want to do is we want to say, well, okay, well, why does this happen? Kind of our next step. what makes our assumptions work in reality here. So one thing I'm going to do that's going to help us later, and in some ways I mentioned that this theory that we're talking about seems a little bit old, right? In that we're talking about a theory that was developed at the the early part of the 20th century, and nowadays we don't think so much about Rockefellers and Carnegies as the big monopolists. And so what I'm going to do is just describe a different version of this diagram that's going to let us think, I'm hoping will let us think a little bit, using these tools, thinking about what are our modern monopolies today, or our modern giant firms today. So I'm thinking of, Amazon and, I don't know if Costco is a good example, but, Costco has market power, I guess you could say. Maybe even, tech firms like Facebook and stuff like that. So I'm going to develop this idea of the so-called flat marginal cost curve, right? So this is kind of the uber simple model of a firm, and you just assume that marginal costs and average costs are the same, and there's some fixed amount, right? So how does this work? You're thinking about haircuts. Every haircut I produce costs me $10, right? The first one, the 1,000th one, it costs me $10 to produce it, right? Every grilled cheese I make costs me $2. They don't go up as I do more and more and more of the activity, as we've sort of assumed in the more realistic version. In this simple version, everything is just flat, right? And so marginal costs and cost per unit are the same. So the nice thing about this, and I'm going to work an example here, is that my flat marginal cost curve is just that, right? On the left-hand side here, you can see marginal cost is equal to average cost. Maybe think about that number, PC as just being the cost. We would argue that in a competitive industry, the price has to be equal to this cost, right? If it was more, everybody would enter. If it was less, everybody would exit the industry. So the price winds up being exactly at this point. And you can see kind of what the nice thing about this is that now there's no area between supply and demand, right, below price yet above supply, because the supply curve is just flat, effectively. And so everything is consumer surplus as above, right, up there. But when the monopolist comes along, right, and organizes this industry, well, we can find the marginal revenue curve that goes along with this demand curve. It's right here. And then we just say, okay, well, the same rule still applies. Profits are maximized by marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, right? And we can go up and get the price off the demand curve, and we can do the same old math. Producer surplus for the monopolist is the blue-gray there. The purple above that is consumer surplus, and then the orange is the deadweight loss. So you can kind of just look at this, and it's a little bit simpler to analyze. In fact, I have a nice little example here. I'm going to I'll work here in a second. Okay, I think I got it all in my head here, so I can work it. And one thing you might be saying, well, why take our simple model, which was so nice, and make it even simpler? Well, as I say, when we talk about entrepreneurship and competition and even game theory, we're going to learn to love this way of thinking about the world. It'll be a lot of fun. Anyway, so I thought maybe I could just work an example here for posterity's sake of how all this works. So maybe we're thinking about my local grilled cheese operation, or maybe whatever your preferred industry is. We'll stick with grilled cheese, I guess. Quantity, price. There's a lot of places, there's a lot of carts around the city selling grilled cheeses or maybe breakfast sandwiches. How about that? And it costs everybody $2 to make a sandwich everywhere, right? And so we can ask the question, what would happen if Baker somehow became the breakfast sandwich baron of New York and took charge of all the carts and organized them under one umbrella, right? Monopolize the industry. It's a crazy example, but anyway, so we would start off by just kind of doing the following. We'll draw in this demand curve like that. And to do the numbers, or to do all these things out explicitly, you kind of need some numbers. So I'll say that this is 10, and I think I have my PC line here we'll call this marginal cost equals average cost equals P, right? Meaning that in a competitive world where it costs everybody $2 to make a grilled cheese sandwich, well, they would charge this amount, and no one would enter and no one would exit this industry, and I'll call that 2. And I think I say this is at 80, right? So in this competitive, did I just say grilled cheese? Breakfast sandwiches, stick with the example. In this competitive world, right, price reflects the costs of production. It's kind of a nice way of saying it. You can see here we can calculate consumer surplus by observing that all this is a distance of 8. This is 80. So this triangle here is 80 times 8 is 640. Divided by 2 is 320, right? So we might say consumer surplus at competition is 320. And we could say that producer surplus in competition is 0, right? There's no gap there. But now, if Baker comes along and monopolizes the industry, well, we have to add in our marginal revenue curve, right? Which I will just draw like that. Now, when you take Eco 200 or Eco 300, you'll figure out that there is some interesting mathematics behind all this. For our purposes, we can just sort of look at this and, I'd give you the numbers where all this happens. And I'll suppose that this is at 40, and this point here is at 6, right? So those are the numbers, and we say, okay, well, if Baker were to monopolize the breakfast sandwich industry in the city around Hunter, he would restrict the quantity of sandwiches he was selling every morning to 40 instead of 80, right? And he would charge $6 a sandwich instead of 2, right? Now, what does that get for society? Well, you can see here a lot less people eat the breakfast sandwiches. And why does Baker do this? Even though people would be willing to pay more than the costs of making a sandwich, because he wants to make profits. He wants, in other words, to make this rectangle here as large as he possibly can, right? Anyways, in this case, his producer surplus in monopoly is 4, is this distance, times 40. Why is it so hard for me to do that in my head? 4 times 6, 160? Yes? Consumer surplus in monopoly is then, well, let's see here. It's everything up here. It's 4, this distance, times 40, 160 divided by 2, 80. Thank you. So we can see here that total societal welfare is 240, right? So it stands to reason that we now know what this is here, this deadweight loss, right, is $80, right, or lost exchange. People who would have bought a nice breakfast sandwich but can't because of the monopolization of the industry, right? That's the deadweight loss. So maybe I can shade it in here. Here's consumer surplus up here, and then that, right? So there's an example of the workings of all the mathematics. And of course, I'm heartened to know that I didn't just make up some numbers that don't work, because if you calculated out this deadweight loss directly, you get the same answer. Yes, question? Yeah. Let me even write that. The deadweight loss is 80. Okay. All right. So, and keep that example in your head. It's nice to know that there's multiple ways of kind of capturing the same logic. We'll be using that a little bit later. But let's have I'm going to start my attendance sheet going left to right here. I know every time it seems like I miss one person, so please check your attendance grades on Brightspace. Thank you. Just to make sure I didn't forget you. And we can now back up a little bit and start thinking about some of the fun stuff and some of the practicalities of monopoly and policy. And so, maybe we'll just have a little bit of an open-ended discussion and get out of the dry theory. Indeed, that's one of the great things about economics is, you really have to see what happens when your theory hits the road. And so we might first ask, in my example, why did Baker, why was he a haircut monopolist in his little example there, right? Why didn't somebody else come along and set up another barber shop in his town? Well, you can go down to this bullet point here, getting a little ahead of myself here, and say that, well, oftentimes a license, right, is a barrier to entry that keeps people out of the industry, right? And you can probably note to self, that would be a great thing to have you write a little. Find a neat example of a barrier to entry and tell me about it. Because as I was talking, a whole bunch of things popped into my mind. But that's licensing restrictions. We have them for a reason. That's interesting as well. But they often function as a barrier to entry. So one example that pops into my mind, I was just reading about it a couple days ago, was in New Jersey, liquor licenses, right, in certain towns are really hard to come by. So if you're a restaurant with one of those, you're really almost the only restaurant in town that can serve beer or wine with dinner in certain parts of New Jersey. But more common examples go back to sort of thinking about things that might only keep one thing in the industry. The old school stuff would just be, well, natural resource ownership. I own the mine, right? Or I own the oil well. And that's the only oil well around, and so therefore I'm a monopolist, right? Diamonds, very prominent example, right? Run by the, and put a pin in that one because I'm going to come back to that when we talk about innovation in the diamond and gem industry. But that's a prominent example where someone owns a natural resource that gives them monopoly power. You might own a critical technology, right? You might be the only one who knows how to do something. This was a big deal in the early history of the United States when people talked about the organization of textile mills, and it was these jealously guarded secrets as to how to produce things, right? So Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, was really angry that he couldn't keep his innovation to himself, right? That everybody else figured out. But sometimes you can't, right? And of course, we can also note that, coming down here a little bit, that oftentimes the government creates, right, through laws, exclusive technology. So you might put that, in the back of your mind as well. What's that all about? So Pfizer, for example, has patents or patents on certain sorts of medications, right? That's another type of monopoly. Of course, copyright is a form of this as well, right? Another legally created right. So, for example, you can't just go make a Star Wars movie because you're violating the intellectual property that Disney has a copyright over, right? We have a lot of great stuff to say about all of this. So, but they're barriers to entry, right? Sometimes it just is the case that one company there's things that we call economies of scale, right? And so being really large just conveys a really big cost benefit. Right, or cost advantage, I should say, not benefit. And so you think about things like a company that builds a power plant. It's a giant, large-scale investment. Not so much now as it used to be, but you spend all that money, and you can basically just satisfy all the market demand with one company, right? So a power company is what we call a natural monopoly. The cable company might be something like that as well, right? That you put up all the poles. And you have your one sort of source for all the channels, and that also fulfills the natural demand. And people often point to the MTA as a good example of this, right? Another monopoly. By the way, it's not a coincidence that at least the power and the MTA are also regulated, right? It's kind of interesting here if you want to follow some examples. If you take a quick read of the New York City. So I have this little Wikipedia page linked, but you can learn from this that it wasn't always a monopoly. And at one point in time, there was actually competing subway companies in the city, right? So this is one reason why we have letters and numbers. They were two different companies that were later managed, came under the purview of the MTA and bound together. So it's interesting, my son, actually all three of my kids, have really strong opinions about certain subway lines and if they're good or bad. This one's terrible, that one's the best. I don't know if you do as well, So it wasn't always a monopoly, but it was once again put under the umbrella of a government organization. So we might want to talk a little bit about why that's the case. So I have this interesting example here that kind of reflects a different reason why there might be some natural monopolies, and I don't even know if it's still a thing. But this is kind of when I think about you finding an example of barriers to entry creating market power, I have this link. I can't seem to, this computer's always been a little weird. But it's about the so-called Bronx lobster fishery. I'm not sure if anybody knew that there was a subspecies of lobster called the Bronx lobster. But yes, it's an industry a fishery that exists in and around, I guess, City Island, East Riverish area. And it's a smaller lobster, not quite as red as the cousins up in New England there. But that little article is about how there was a character who basically maintained exclusive rights over this fishery. And sometimes he was a colorful character and would engage in intimidation and violence. Maybe he was accused of it. If you read the article, it's kind of fun. But that can be a barrier to entry as well, right? That you can the good old-fashioned way of keeping people out of your industry is intimidation, right? So this is a big question, right, and a very big policy question. And if you know your U.S. history, it was a big question in the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we have this idea that monopoly is in fact bad for society, right? That the prices are too high and the quantities are too low. So this means that as policymakers, we might have to diagnose the problem and do something, right? So we might say that the most natural thing to do is just break up the monopolist, and indeed, or prevent it from starting at the beginning. And this is really the basis for antitrust policy, right? You probably hear about these antitrust suits that crop up every now and then. The idea is to say, well, Baker tried to take over the breakfast sandwich industry in New York and organize it. Why would we let him do that, right? We'll say, Baker, that's illegal. You can't do that. We're going to just, make sure that there's many smaller firms. And so that's one thing to do. And that might be the obvious thing to do in a case like this, right? Where there was really no difference between the costs of producing grilled cheese. I did it the exact same way when I monopolized the industry vis-a-vis the point when I didn't. Now, that's obviously difficult to do for things like the MTA and things like power companies, right, where there's these big returns to just having one large organizational structure. So you can't sort of break the MTA up into a bunch of individual subway lines, right, or have parallel tracks to encourage competition, right? That's just wasteful. So in those situations, what you might want to do is take your natural monopoly, you might call it, and then just somehow regulate it. And indeed, a lot of policy is based on this idea. And so over here in this diagram, what you might do is you might say, fine, Baker, go ahead, monopolize that breakfast sandwich industry. You've said there's some advantage to doing so. You can coordinate and better use ingredients. I don't know. But what we're going to do then is we're going to legislate the price that you charge, right? And what price do we want to charge? Well, we would like to get as close as possible to this competitive price, right? If we say Baker can't charge more than $2.50 for a sandwich, well, then that'll push him out here, right? And he'll start to he'll be monopolized, but he'll behave very much like a competitive firm. Hopefully you get the idea there. I know I haven't made this concrete, but that's kind of the idea there. And it actually opens up a whole bunch of really interesting economics, because then you run into questions like the following one. You say, okay, well, conceptually, we see what we want to do. We want to charge Baker something like, we want to set the price close to his marginal cost by law, right? And then he'll have to be competitive. But then we have this problem, how do we know what his costs are, right? We could do a deep dive into, how you make a breakfast sandwich and what the cost of eggs and all that stuff. We could even ask Baker, and in fact, that might be the best way to figure it out. But there's a problem there. What will Baker do if we ask him how much it costs him to make a sandwich? He'll lie, right? He'll say, oh my God, it cost me $5 to make a sandwich. Ooh, $6, That's what it costs me. And then we'll say, okay, well, we'll make a law that says the price has to be $6, and we've done nothing, right? And this is a fascinating area of economics. We have a class, I don't know if we offer it every semester, on contracting and information and economics. And this is a classic mechanism design problem, right? Where people have vested interests in certain sorts of answers to questions, and we're trying to elicit truth from them, right? And we have to set up arrangements so that they do that. It's really a hot, neat area. Okay, so those are really the big two solutions, and I think I have some more. I'll go through some of the history of that, just because it's my one chance to kind of make it a little bit, to pop a little bit, I guess. One of the things we're going to talk about, however, as we go on, especially when we talk about economic growth, is we're going to talk about how monopoly profits are also often a giant incentive for innovation, right? And how this is a real engine of growth. So, for example, what you're trying to do if you're an entrepreneur is create something no one's ever created before, and that will give you a monopoly in that thing, right? And once you have that thing, you make an enormous amount of money, whatever, but you wouldn't have made it without the possibility of that reward, right? So you got to love this. It's a delicious irony, right? You're saying that in every thriving competitive system, there is a bit of monopoly, right? At least for a while, until someone else comes along and invents the next big thing, right? And so this is an important, in some ways this is baked into our system, and that's why we have patents and copyrights, right? To spurn innovation, right? The profits at the end of the rainbow there cause people to innovate. So that's a little. Well, it's okay. So antitrust law has had a little bit of all of this kind of stuff. So you don't have to go very far to note that we have price regulation for a lot of natural monopolies. Every year we hear about how Con Ed wants to raise its rates, and there's a big dust up, right, in the policy-making bodies about that. So that's one example. One I just saw in the news today, right? I throw on the morning news, so maybe my kids will do something other than look at their phones. It doesn't work, but I watch the morning news, and I saw today that the price of packages for the United States Postal Service might be going up, right? A stamp might be going up. And once again, the USPS isn't free to just raise its rates whenever it wants to. The idea was that when it was established, it was a natural monopoly, right? And that its rates should be regulated. So really one of the key moments in antitrust legislative history was the Sherman Act of 1890. I didn't follow my link before class, but it's kind of an interesting little tale here on some of these, on the Sherman Antitrust Act, if you want to look at it. And basically it was passed, you saw it there, it was passed in 1890 because people began to get upset about what was perceived to be these giant companies that were price gouging the public, right? And making enormous amounts of money. It's funny how these problems just never go away, right? We still have that around to everybody, those things still occur today. So one of the first big ones here was Standard Oil, right? And that was Rockefeller. Am I right about that? I think it was, right? We'll see later that for a long time he was the richest man in the United States by a pretty considerable margin. Yeah, Carnegie was the steel guy. Anyway, so he had this giant, or was Carnegie Railroads? J.P. Morgan's steel. Okay, so who's the railroads then? Was that Rocket? I don't know what the, yes.
It's the Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt, that's the name that I'm missing. Thank you. Okay, so the funny thing is that these names are all over New York City, right? In addition to another one, which was Astor, John Jacob Astor, we'll also talk about, right, who was a big, his monopoly was the fur trade, right? That was the thing that he ran. Anyways, so one of the first big things that happened under the Sherman Act was Standard Oil was broken up, right, into 34 smaller independent companies. This was 1911, which became kind of the things that you might recognize, Chevron, Exxon. Some of them are still around today. There was, U.S. Steel was this giant monopoly for a while, but it was interesting, was actually outcompeted by Bethlehem Steel. And so it's actually, I mix up my Pennsylvania industrial towns, but there's a really neat museum, like Museum of Industry. I think it's where Bethlehem Steel, which is no longer with us as a company, is. It's you can go there and see all the old giant machines and stuff. It's neat. So Kodak, interestingly, which is also no longer with us. By the way, it's no accident that these firms, many of you probably haven't even heard of some of these businesses. This would have shocked and surprised me when I was your age, that something like Kodak could no longer really be a functional firm. It was such a big deal, right? The Polaroids, the film, everywhere you went, there was Photomat, which was a place where you dropped off your film to have it developed. It was just, it was crazy that it's just sort of gone, right? Don't even get me started on Blockbuster. Huh? Yeah, that's where we, back in the, the meme. I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago. Anyways, so Kodak, right, actually was sued for antitrust violations because what they had done was they produced some enormous amount of the film in the United States, and then they went around and they actually bought up all the smaller independent film producers to sell their film. And they were sued by the government, and basically it was said you can't do that, right? AT&T, right, American Telephone and Telegraph, right? They ran the whole phone lines in the United States for a long time. And so back in the day, you used to have to wait till after 5 o'clock to get the nice rates. You had to make long distance and local calls. They were very different. People were worried about the rates they were charging, and so AT&T was broken up into, I want to say, 7 different local telephone companies. And hopefully you can appreciate the logic. It was to kind of get more competition in these industries. So AT&T, my local version was SNET, we called it, right? That was Southern New England Telephone. That was our local telephone company. More recently, Microsoft has been sued in a couple of different ways by the government. One lawsuit was about the operating system, right? So Microsoft was the only provider of Microsoft Windows, and the allegation was that they were charging a price that was too high for these. They were price gouging. But we will see when we start to think about strategic interactions in game theory that Microsoft is actually going to, using a picture like this, Microsoft had a really interesting argument they made to defend themselves, right, based on something called limit pricing. They were then sued a little bit later, and the argument was that their browser was too closely integrated to the operating system, and this prevented other browsers from installation, such as like Netscape was the big competitor at the time. Microsoft, I think, won the first suit and lost the second, and it was ruled that, well, you got to let some people into your operating system. So it is kind of this, it's a really interesting thing to think about, all of this market power and all of that. every time something happens like what we have going on now with oil prices, you always sort of wonder about this, should businesses be able to charge higher prices when conditions change out there, right? During a crisis, I guess you could say a crisis is where something gets very hard to, or gets more difficult to supply. And do you raise price or what do you do? And this debate, by the way, goes back to medieval times, if not further, right? And so if you can find the old medieval monks describing things like the just price, which was kind of the, a religious person, the price that they would charge, Not too much, but not too little either, right? You have to live here. It's also interesting, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit, that some of these recent antitrust controversies are often don't fit into this model quite as well as we might like, right? So we have Meta and Google, and we worry about them monopolizing something that's a little bit different. And there is also this complication now that hopefully if we have some time later in class we can talk about these so-called networks or two-sided markets where consumers are producers and producers are consumers at the same time, right? So I've thought a little bit about this, and I have a colleague, so here's my shameless pitch here. We had a little paper on television viewership. Professor George she specializes in media economics, is one of her big specialties if you want to take her class. And it was about societal welfare, consumer surplus and stuff like that. But we were just discussing the local television news market. And this is a two-sided market because essentially what happens is stations are trying to get you to watch, right? Because you in essence are a recipient of advertising, right? By the same token, what you want to do is learn something about what's going on in local conditions, right? So you're consuming news, but also providing eyeballs, right, in some ways, for advertising. It makes things a little bit more interesting and complex. So we're going to think about some of this stuff, but we're going to need to expand our toolkit. The other thing I want to talk about are these big retail monopolies, and I'm going to use, once again, a diagram, something like this, to describe that. So what I'm thinking about is Amazon and Costco and places like that. I'm really resisting the temptation to talk more about it, but I'll try. Okay, so there's always an option when you're a policymaker that I sometimes think gets short shrift. And it may be like passé to say, but one approach is to just do nothing, right? And that's kind of underrated. What do I mean by this? Well, maybe what I'm trying to say is that every time you step into the policymaking arena, what you do will have consequences you did not anticipate, right? Usually you don't like those unanticipated consequences. So government licensing, we say, oh, that's a good thing. Every producer is guaranteed to then have certain skills and have certain, be of a certain quality. We can know that they've taken classes or that they fulfill some standards, but there are these downsides to this, right? And that oftentimes we wind up with rules that were like, well, really, is this what we wanted to do? So I have this link here. And of course, a lot of people sell, if it comes up. Right. So a lot of people can get arrested for things that you're like, well, really? This isn't what we had in mind. Selling churros, say, on the subway might be illegal, right, if you have a licensing regime in place. And of course, you might set things up, or you might not have intended this, but you might create a black market for licenses, right, in the background. And of course, one even worse consequence of this is you might be hurting people you would like to help the most, right? In so doing. So that's one thing you might have to think about. There's another, this is a famous one as well. Come on, man. It's not coming up. But every now and then you have these discussions, there's these discussions about, I don't know what happened there, about the so-called hair braiding industry, where people often, you can get braids and put in your hair, but it turns out you need a license to do that, and you need a fully blown hairdressing license to do that, right? And people are like, well, why? Why do we have this industry set up like this? And of course, I don't know if there's a market for such licenses in the background, but you can imagine, right? So there are these trade-offs when you want to stride into this area of managing monopoly power. And of course, in other situations, we intentionally create it. And we have this, we create government patents and copyrights, and they are intended to create incentives to innovate, right? So you put in a policy in place, and the idea is that, well, at the end of the process, the development process, maybe you create something that people really like or really need or saves lives even, and your incentive for so doing is, the monopoly profits. And what you try to do is you say, all right, well, maybe we can put a time length on this thing, right? And so, we can have a patent last for X amount of years. The idea is that gives you some monopoly profits, but then lets people compete, right? Once that time expires. And so as economists, we often debate whether we're hitting the sweet spot correctly, right? So for example, is the patent length for new drugs, right? Is it too long or is it too short? That's a question. Other new technologies as well, right? So there has been this, long history of patent and copyright law in the United States that protects things for a certain amount of time. I think the stylized fact is that the protection has gotten longer, but there's carve-outs for certain things like drugs. Copyright is a really weird one. This is intellectual property. So does anybody know, it's actually in the original US Constitution. I believe you have I think it's like 16 years. You have rights over, if you write a book, that's your intellectual property. But I think in the original US Constitution it was 16 years. I might be wrong, it might be 14 or something like that. Is that the, oh, okay. Attendance sheet still going around. You can get it after class if necessary. Does anybody, now copyright, it's the law has kind of expanded over time. Does anybody know what it is now? If you write a great book, how long you have that property, your intellectual property? It's the life of the author, right, plus 70 years. Right, so it's gotten a little bit longer. And maybe I hinted at this notion of regulatory capture, that sometimes your licensing regimes wind up, doing the bidding of the producers. People sometimes call the extensions of this copyright law the Walt Disney rule. For a long time, it seemed like every time Disney's important intellectual property, thank you, was about to fall into the public domain, what would happen is a law would go into Congress that would extend the protection a little bit longer, right? So I think, let's hope this link works. Ah, good. I don't know why my braiding link didn't work. But this is always kind of a fun thing to look at here. There's this website that has Public Domain Day, and some of us, I'm fast forwarding a little bit here, like to sort of see every New Year's Day, New Year's 2026, we like to see what new stuff has fallen into the public domain. And so here we have all the books. Oh, As I Lay Dying. The Maltese Falcon. Hey, that's a cool book. Dashiell Hammett. The Little Engine That Could. Nancy Drew books. Wow. So we get all that stuff. What about movies? Do we have some movies here? Oh, the characters and comics and you can now use these if you want to in your, in however, whatever it is you're doing. Where did it go? So Betty Boop wrote Blondie and Dagwood. How about that? I guess most people don't really care about that anymore. 9 new Mickey Mouse cartoons. Do we have any films? Okay, so these have fallen into some greats there. The one that pops out to me, I guess, is All Quiet on the Western Front. So Public Domain Day, kind of fun, right? All that stuff falls in it. That's the trade-off between innovation and monopoly power at work here. Okay, so a lot of this is the kind of a way of just all these things to think about here. Let's just quickly entertain here in our last couple minutes of class an analytical extension to all of this, which is the price discrimination case. So let's rewind to the very first time I talked about market power, and I talked about economics lessons in my building, right? Now, one thing that I sort of hinted at I could do is instead of having a little advertisement that said economics lessons $80, right? I could just say economics lessons, price inquire within, right? And then if the people who wanted lessons called me up, I could sort of size them up, you know, and say, well, this person doesn't have a lot of money, I can charge them this price. This person seemingly would pay a lot, I can charge them a higher price, right? Now I can charge a different price to every different consumer. And we call this idea generically price discrimination, right? When you charge different groups different prices, right? So oftentimes this becomes, you know, something like, well, we're going to announce a really high price, a sticker price, but then what we'll do is we'll give you a discount, right? Once I sort of figure out, you know, this model of car costs $80,000, but you have good credit, and you know, I'm in a good mood today, so maybe we can set up some stuff so you pay $70,000, right? Of course, colleges are excellent at this, right? The sticker price out there is often $90,000, and then they actually look at your financial records, figure out exactly what your pressure point is, and say that's what we'll charge you, right? That's an example as well. The gym does this, right? You know, there's a couple gyms in my neighborhood, and it's really hard to figure out what their rates are. The reason is they want to sort of, you know, well, we'll give you a family package, and they'll tailor it to, you know, what they think you can pay. There's other stuff that is, you know, early bird specials. That's another form of this. Fast passes, if you go to Disney, right, you can jack up the fee you pay and skip lines and stuff like that. These are all examples of what we would call price discrimination. Now, one of the big consequence here, I should have made this point in bold, is that our marginal revenue logic kind of goes out the window, right? In that every time you lower the price for a new customer, you don't necessarily have to lower it for the customers before, right? When I lower my price from 100 to 80, I don't have to lower it to 80 for everybody, right? I can charge 100 to the first consumer and 80 to the second. So in some sense, I'm able to kind of map out my demand curve here. And this, by the way, is something that you do a lot of if you take a business economics class or an Eco 300 class, you kind of learn the mechanics of this because it turns out to be a useful business tool a lot of times. So I don't know if I have to do this in great detail, but if you think about my economics lesson example, if I could charge each of my consumers 1, 2, and 3 different prices, I would just charge them their willingnesses to pay, right? That is to say, I would basically just read my points off the demand curve. I would say this person can pay this, that's what I'll charge them. This person can pay this, that's what I'll charge them. This person can pay this, that's what I'll charge them. So in some sense, my marginal revenue curve kind of moves to correspond with my demand curve. And you can see that, you know, the mechanics in this example is I would just, you know, charge person 1 100, person 2 80, and person 3 60. And since my marginal costs in my example were always 50, I will provide all of those units, right? I make money from each of those units. So diagrammatically, this is kind of a rough sketch of the logic. You can kind of see what happens if I can charge high demanders. You see my upper left diagram. I charge a price to the high demanders called P high, and then a price to the low demanders called P low. Well, that's the producer surplus I capture, right? Those rectangles up there in the upper left. So if I can charge a high and a low price, I do that. That's great, right? It's better than just charging a single price. Well, why stop at just P high and P low? Why not move to P high, P middle, and P low, right? And you can see what happens there is now I get a whole bunch of assembled rectangles, 3 different rectangles up there, like that. And if I continue the process ad infinitum, eventually what I can do is charge everybody along the demand curve their exact willingness to pay, and in so doing, I capture all of the consumer surplus, right? Now, this is a little bit uncomfortable for our welfare analysis and actually serves to point out one of its big flaws here, because you can see here that I wind up producing the competitive quantity, which is what we like from the perspective of society, which maximizes consumer surplus. We like that too. The problem is the seller gets all of the surplus and the consumers get none of it, right? So even though the sum of everything adds up to what it would in a competitive market, the outcome looks a lot different. And we call this perfect price discrimination. And maybe it signals for us that, well, A, if you could do this as a business, you probably will. And if you're a business runner, you probably should if you want to think about it that way. But B, we might also care about how things are distributed. And that's kind of lost in many of our models here. So really in this case of price discrimination, this doesn't apply. Mainly because when I lower the price, I don't lose that red rectangle there. I don't have to lower the price for previous units, right? In my haircut example, it would be the case where I don't have a price out there, but for you, a haircut is $14. For you, it's $17, right? I kind of work it that way. Okay, so I've hinted at a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about going forward, just along the way here. Oh, a little bit, tad early here. And one of the great things about all of this is we're going to be able to take what we have in place and think a lot about strategy and strategic interaction, which is a lot of fun and really interesting using these tools. And this, will introduce the subject by thinking about, I guess, market structures in between competition and monopoly. I guess you could say almost everything falls somewhere in between these two. And it'll be pretty cool. We'll start that next week, and I guess I'll call it a day. At this point, if you haven't signed the attendance sheet, please drop by and do so on your way out.